I will start recording the session now because I'm just going to talk about that. So when submitting the assignment, remember that you need to combine your document into one single Word document or a single PDF to submit it. Complications arise when people try and submit multiple Word documents. So if you tried to submit your body of your assignment and then your appendices separately, that can be problematic. So I would suggest that you combine your document when you've finished it and submit it as one Word document or one PDF. If you use the PDF format, then none of your formatting and your pages will move around. It will be set, and that will make life easier for you. So either submit it, as I said, as a Word document or as a PDF. I know that many of you work across different platforms, and you might be using a Mac or you might be using a PC. Although this process and everything is Mac compatible, if you submit your assignment in Pages or Notes or some of the other formats that they use on Mac, it can fail to open on this PC. So I would advise against submitting it in any other format than Word, because there can be compatibility issues. So as I said, submit your assignment, and it isn't complicated. It isn't. There isn't anything that you specifically need to do. You simply click on the tile, and when I open it, I see this and view and grade all submissions because I'm the lecturer. But when you submit that assignment, when you click on that tile, this box here says submit assignment. You click on it, you upload your document, your Word, your single Word document, or your single PDF, and then you press submit. You will then get an automated email from the DLE saying that you've successfully submitted your assignment. So it's not complicated, it's not difficult. You just need to submit it before the deadline. As it says there, the deadline is Monday the 30th of January at 3 p.m. At about 3:15, I will close the page. So if on Monday the 30th, if you're running into problems with submitting your assignment, then please email me and I will be watching my emails for any issues. But after the deadline, you will not be able to submit your assignment online. Okay. If you have a legitimate extension, then there will be provision made for that. Okay, so we submit our assignment. So that was the first thing to talk about. In module introduction, there's some additional information, and there was there's the Word document called supporting information, which is what you need to submit as Appendix 1 in your assignment. Additional to that, the subject librarian, Julie Moody, has put a number of additional resources on the library page, some referencing information, some EndNote information. If you're going to use EndNote, I don't insist that you use it, but if you're going to use EndNote, and if at this point you need to access the interlibrary loan process, there's some information about that there. So that was the additional resources section. Now we'll get on to sort of the business of today. I apologise again enormously for the technical problems that we had a fortnight ago, but I am going to spend a little bit of time just recapping the ethics session that I was going to deliver that day. I'm not going to be able to deliver it all, but we will fly through it quickly just so I cover the key points, and more importantly cover some of the key points that you might want to think about when critically reviewing your articles. We're then going to move on to the data analysis side. Now, the data analysis side has two components. You have the quantitative data analysis is already there, and that's a narrated PowerPoint that Jenny has supplied. If you have any questions regarding analysis of quantitative research, please refer to Jenny. She's very happy to answer any questions that you might have on quantitative analysis and particularly statistical analysis. And then I'm going to cover a little bit about qualitative analysis this afternoon. I've also put an article there that you might want to have a look at, which looks at specific to content analysis. So that's an additional resource. So that's the plan for this afternoon. Are there any questions at that point? Is there anything else that you would like me to discuss this afternoon? No questions at all? No comments? Nothing else that you'd like me to cover? Okay, well, if there are no other questions, I will start with a brief overview of the ethics. As I said, we would have had more time for this, but we're not able to on this particular. So just to answer a question, the word count. Yes, as per university regulations, there's a 10% allowance for word count, so 10% under or over. So on a 3,000 word assignment, that would be sort of 3,300 or 2,700 within those parameters. It would be perfectly acceptable. If you are running over on words, then have a look at what you can put in the appendix as a provision, because the use of appendix is, as I've said before, a useful mechanism to help you with your word count. But just be aware that anything in the appendices is there to support what you're talking about in the main body of the assignment. It shouldn't be instead of things being in the assignment. So as with the critical analysis of each of the individual articles, that needs to be in the appendix. That is a requirement, but the synthesis of those articles in terms of the thematic analysis needs to be in the main body. And so it's about writing in a succinct manner. So if you feel yourself being quite wordy or quite descriptive, just check yourself and see if you can tailor your word count accordingly. Any other questions? Right, I don't. I'm going to leave it on this screen so that you can see it. And can you all see the first screen, the screen saying ethics and healthcare research? Yep, okay, great. Okay, so we're going to just have a little look at, as I said, a quick slide through the ethics side. We're just going to have a look at what's meant by research ethics, have a little bit of a conversation about the historical background and some of the challenges, and an overview of ethical issues and some further reading. And as I said, this is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour. There's going to be, we're just going to get through it quite quickly so that I know that you've had the information. So what do we mean by research ethics? Obviously, if you go on to do research yourself and you go on to prepare a research proposal, this is going to be even more fundamental to what you're thinking. But in all of the research that you're reading presently, there should be some indication of what ethical considerations were given when they undertook the study. And you might read your research and you might think, why didn't they do it this way? Or why didn't they include a different group? Or why didn't they have a non-treatment group? And the answer to that sometimes is ethical constraints. We've always got to practice ethically. And so when you're reading your research, you might look at it and go, what was the rationale for their decision making? And often the rationale for their decision making is guided by ethics and the ethical controls that we have. And we have a very rigid and very robust system of monitoring and reviewing research in this country and internationally. And from a historic perspective, that's because of things that have happened in the past. If we look back in history and see that some of the key examples are there, we all know about Nazi experiments in the Second World War. We probably all heard about the thalidomide tragedies in the 50s. Some of you may or may not be aware of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which was in America. All of these particular instances caused international uproar and international shame, and they gave rise to certain regulations and guidance. So following the Second World War, obviously we had the Nuremberg trials, and then we had the Nuremberg Code. From that, we had the Declaration of Helsinki, and that's really guided our research ethics and research principles since, in the last century and since then. Obviously, there have been instances where these regulations have been stretched or misinterpreted or intentionally, what's the word I'm looking for? Intentionally ignored, and people have been discovered. I don't know if you're aware of certain studies that have happened historically and in the recent past that have been ethically questionable. Can anybody think of any specific examples? There's certain members of the audience today that I would say they're probably very aware of some of them. Anybody can think of something that's happened in the last 15 years that's ethically questionable? Yes, Dolly the sheep, definitely ethically questionable. Yes, the genetics examples, the sort of designer children and ethics of genetic manipulations that we're talking about are stretching the realms of research. Some of the stem cell work that is ethically questionable. Anything that came into the popular press recently that anybody can think of? Yes, absolutely. Yeah, the girl who wanted to be cryogenically suspended, I think, not frozen. I'm not going to burst into song. We've had hand and head and all sorts of transplants that have happened recently that one would question the ethics of what's been going on. But in terms of research that's been published not recently, it's quite old now, would be the questionable research undertaken by Andrew Wakefield about the MMR vaccine. where his ethics and his research study was not robust. He published results before they were ready. So there are a number of really prevalent examples of instances where research ethics have been stretched or questionable, and it's very difficult. If you're undertaking a research study, you need to jump through many hoops to get it approved, and so you might be reading things now and thinking, gosh, how did this get through an ethics committee? Or is the reason that they've done a slightly poorer study or slightly less substantial study are the constraints because of ethics? If you're interested in ethics and other aspects of law and ethics, then there are other modules that you can undertake, but it is an incredibly fascinating subject, and there's lots of further reading that I can direct you to. Other guidance and legislation that's obviously determines how we practice is our code of conduct if we're nurses, and relevant codes of conduct depending on which professional body we belong to. We've also got data protection acts, we've got trial regulations, and we've also got our university ethics guidelines, and we've got our local trusts. And if you look at research that you're reading that's been undertaken in the NHS, it has its own research ethics committee. The thing that we're always thinking about when we're looking at research ethics, and you might look at this in your studies that you're reading, is that research should do no harm. So we are always trying to guard against potentially harming or causing distress to our participants. So our aim is always to protect the participants and the researcher. So not just the people we're researching, but the people doing research as well. And we also need to be aware of coercion, and coercion that might be overt or covert. So there might be obvious coercion if you're a senior member of staff who's asking a question of a junior member of staff, but there might also be slightly less overt coercion if the study is being funded by a particular body. And when you're looking at your research, if you're looking at a drug trial or a randomised control trial that's been funded by a particular organisation, is there some coercion or bias that's creeping into this research question? I've said the moral blindness of the researcher, and this might be intentional or unintentional. So I'm going to skip over the activity because you can think about that in your own time. But when you're looking at research ethics, you'll be thinking about a research problem, and you're ending your assignment with a research question. And when you're phrasing that research question, so in those top two banners, so that last piece of your narrative review, the question that you ask has got to be ethical. If you ask a question that would not stand up the test of an ethics committee, then it's not an appropriate research question. So when you're making your concluding statement, ensure that the question that you are asking is researchable. When you're thinking about the research question, you're not going to go this far in your assignment, but when you're looking at the research that you're reading, think about the research question, think about how it was phrased, think about how they then went on to design their research study, how they collected the data, how they analysed the data, and how they disseminated the information. And all of those different phases of your research study need to have be managed and controlled by ethics. And some of the ethical principles that we think of are about integrity and competence, non-maleficence, beneficence, autonomy, honesty, responsibility, or privacy, confidentiality, justice, and dignity. So I've put them on sort of two sides of the coin. Sorry, I'll just look at this question here. That's a very interesting question that Ashley's asked. Can ethics be subjective? And is it also context driven, is what I think you're asking. So things that might be considered ethically wrong now might not be considered to be ethically wrong in the future. Any research question has to be taken in the social, political, and historical context in which it's driven. So research, and we can see this over time, behaviour and conduct and all sorts are different now than they were 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. So you might look at research that's 10, 15 years old and think it's morally questionable or it's ethically questionable, but it wasn't considered to be that at that particular time. I'm not suggesting that we'll see that difference in the last decade, but if we were looking at research that was done longer ago than that, we might look at it and think that was morally or ethically questionable, just like we look at behaviour and think it might be questionable now, and we didn't think it was questionable then. Things about gender reassignment are going to be a very emotive issue. Some might think for not necessarily ethical grounds, but moral and religious and cultural grounds that surgery is, or gender reassignment is wrong. But you might need to unpick why that is and what's the background to that feeling. So I don't know if that answers your question. So if we just have a look at some of these ideas and principles that I've put up. We talk about ethical theory when we talk about ethics, and we look at the 4 principles put forward by Beauchamp and Chandlis and published widely, the ideas of autonomy, beneficence and non-maleficence, and justice. So the idea that that we should be, us as a researcher and our participants should have autonomy over the information that they give and the information that we collect, that we should do no harm, so the beneficence and non-maleficence, that we should ensure that we are doing good, and that even to avoiding harm and distress when conducting any piece of research. So if we're going to ask somebody a question that could be emotionally challenging, how are we going to manage that participant if they become emotionally distressed? And we talk about ethical theories being duty-based, rights-based, consequence-based and virtue-based. And there's been lots of writing about each of those. And one of the other approaches there, it talks about justice. So we've got to treat everybody fairly. And that can be quite a difficult thing to do when we're looking at collecting data from groups of people that we might be researching to ensure that they are treated fairly. So when we're looking at the research problem, is this problem significant? And will the research benefit others? And if we're asking for research funding, or the research that you're reading has used public money, is it worth it? So we have responsibility to ensure that it is a significant research problem, and that by undertaking this piece of research there will be some benefit. Have we done a thorough literature review to see what studies exist? This is about our knowledge and competence. So what you're undertaking at the moment is a thorough review of the literature, and then you're analysing it using a thematic approach. But by looking at what studies are already out there, you are setting the scene and seeing what's already known about a particular topic. Is it ethical, as it says there, to repeat a study if it's already done before? So should we do something again, confirming, extending or refuting? So if we think that we are going to go ahead and repeat a study and it's going to simply confirm what's already known about a particular subject area, one would ask that is it ethical? It might be that we're changing something. We might be moving the setting from one place to another. A conversation I had this morning was about research that's been undertaken in acute trusts, and there's lots of information about acute trusts, but there's nothing available in the community. So if you could see a study there, you could repeat that study in a different setting, and that would be considered to have benefit, because you're changing the setting that you're focusing on. Or we're extending the knowledge, or we're building theory, or we might be doing the piece of research to refute what's been found in the past. But again, is that ethical? If you are seeking to discount something that's been tested before, is that appropriate? And some would argue that yes, it is. If we're undertaking a practice that doesn't have a benefit or potentially can cause harm, then we are, in a way, duty-bound to evaluate the research and maybe repeat it. So when we're looking at the research question, we need to think about, does it expose the participants to unnecessary risk or invasion of privacy? There are many questions and there are many pieces of research that we might want to do for the development of knowledge, but it isn't appropriate to do them. That we can't do something to a group of people if it's going to cause them harm, and if by undertaking the research it's going to invade their privacy. We must always ensure that our participants have a degree of confidentiality and anonymity, but for the purposes of the study, if we can clearly identify a particular participant, then we really shouldn't be undertaking that research. So you can't ask, if you knew that there was only one male staff nurse in a particular unit and you wanted to find out the views of male staff nurses in a particular unit, that would be an unethical study. So we need to stop and we need to think very carefully about the research problem or question that we're asking. And for your present assignment, this is where you're going to finish. You're going to ask the research question or make the research statement at the end of your assignment, and that's where you can finish. But you need to develop a research question or research statement that has ethical soundness. If you go on to design a study, then there are other considerations to take into account. Is your choice of study design an ethical choice? So when you're reading your research now and you're looking at how the study has been undertaken, how the research has been designed, is it methodologically sound? Is there adequate expertise to undertake the study? Can you see these things? Are these things transparent in the research that you're reading? We mustn't cause any harm to our participants, whether it be physical, psychological, social, economic or legal. So again, it's the principles of non-maleficence and beneficence. Obviously, the physical harm is probably the easiest to mandate against. You're not going to do something to a patient that's going to cause them pain or discomfort or compromise their treatment. Psychological and social, economic and legal might be slightly more difficult to mandate against, especially psychological harm. When undertaking a piece of qualitative research, if you're going to ask somebody how they feel about something, you have to be prepared for the possibility that by asking them that question that they may become distressed. And if they do, what are you going to do about it? So often when preparing a research proposal, you might have some description of how you would support your participants. In the research that you're reading, there should be some discussion as how the participants were looked after or managed. When we're looking at particular vulnerable groups, particular consideration is taken to vulnerable groups such as minors, minority groups, mentally incompetent, so people who do not have the capacity to consent, prisoners. It's very difficult to do research on prisoners, and individuals with diseases such as HIV or AIDS. And I know we've got some paediatric staff amongst the audience today. If you want to do some research on minors, I would desperately advise against it if you're looking for your dissertation. And I'm looking at the specific names on my list there of paediatric practitioners. Undertaking research on any of these vulnerable groups is very, very difficult and very challenging. We would also look at ideas of informed consent. So who are the researcher and their contacts? Who are they, and who's their contact information? Who's sponsoring them? So who is overseeing their research, and what is the purpose of their research? And this is about competence, integrity, responsibility and honesty. And it can be about issues of coercion as well. So what's the underlying purpose of this research? Other issues in terms of informed consent are about the participants. How were they selected? This is going to be a particularly interesting aspect for you as you're reading your research. What was the sampling technique? How did they find these people? How did they come across them? Was their participation voluntary? Could they withdraw at any time? What was the benefit or risks to them, and was it adequately explained? What is the level and type of their involvement, and did you ensure their confidentiality? So when you're reading your research studies, these might be some of the questions that you will ask. When you're going to plan your research, these are questions that will challenge you enormously, and we'll spend a lot of time in the next module looking at these ideas of sampling. Then we're going to collect data, and whenever we're collecting data, we need to ensure that we are respecting our participants, that we've ensured privacy and confidentiality, and we've monitored this very closely. Data analysis is another aspect that we need to think about very closely. So we need to protect the anonymity of our participants. We need to ensure that we analyse the data appropriately. And when we've analysed the data, we need to ensure that we've kept it safely and securely, and disposed of it in the appropriate way if that's our plan. Then we look at research dissemination. So what are we going to do with this piece of research once we've done it? And for most of you, it will be very clear when you're reading your research how they've disseminated it is they've published it. But one of the things that you've got to think about is this idea of authorship order. When they've published it in a specific journal, it has been edited by that journal, and it has been presented in that journal in a particular way. So has the authenticity of the research been changed or managed differently depending on the journal in which it's been published? So if you've gone for a particular type of journal, have you adapted your findings, your presentation to suit the journal that has published it? And if you've done a piece of research, or if the research that you're reviewing has been sponsored by a drug company or sponsored by a particular organisation, is there a conflict of interest? And sometimes it's interesting to look at the authors in a particular research study and see who they are and what they've done before and how that might influence their findings. I'm not suggesting that you Google every single author that you're looking at, but there might be some common names And often when we're looking at a particular research field, we might find repeating names that come up across lots of different pieces of research because there have been some prominent people publishing in a particular area, and it might be worth having a look at some of those common names to see who they are and what their background is and why they are repeatedly publishing in a particular way, and see if that's having an influence or manipulating the findings that they're presenting to you. Obviously, we're looking for integrity and honesty when we're looking at research dissemination. And we're looking obviously for fabrication, falsification and plagiarism. So this is, and we know what all of these things are, and that's where we can really point to a piece of research, for example, that I mentioned earlier by Andrew Wakefield, who did the MMR research. He falsified and fabricated his research findings and presented them, and he was found out, as we all know. But still, when you look at those research findings, and the damage had already been done by the time the research findings were found to be false. Somebody's asked a question here is, can you tell if research has been altered to suit a particular journal? There are some clues, and you'll see that when you look at particular journals. So I don't know if you've got to the stage now when reading your research where you found that particular journals publish in a particular way. So, for example, if there's a theoretical base for the research that's being published, you might find it in the Advanced Journal of Nursing, for example. They like to publish things like that. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation here. Has the research been written for the journal, or has it been adapted to suit the journal? And sometimes when you look at the findings, if you can't track back from the analysis to the method to the aim, and you can't see that clearly, maybe that's because the researcher has, or the people publishing this particular article, have adapted it to suit the journal. So sometimes that's your clue. Does that answer your question? Yes, absolutely. You do need to keep reading. And that's easier said than done. I realise that. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that you will see that pattern in this particular review. But as you go on through your level 7 study, and if you are going to go on and do the second research module and then the dissertation, these kind of theoretical insights are going to be where you're aiming to go. This particular assignment, you might not reach this particular point yet, but you will as you read further. So, ethical issues, we've talked about the right to be included and the right to be protected. We've looked a little bit about recruitment, participants, not subjects. We've talked about consent. We've talked about confidentiality and anonymity. You should never be able to determine who and where you're reading about when you're looking at research findings. We've talked about dissemination, recompense, and compensation. Some would question if it's ethical to pay people for research, but we know that they do. So people who undertake drug trials, for example, get paid. Is that ethical? Some would suggest that it isn't. Should there be some compensation? Again, that could be considered to be morally questionable and ethically questionable. We've talked about data management, and we've talked about some other issues. So when critiquing your research, what questions am I asking? you should be asking some ethical questions. Every single article that you're reviewing, you should have a look to see if there's some ethical issues. And even if it's not a specific theme, and it's unlikely that it is a specific theme, there should be some discussion of the ethics of an article whenever you're discussing them. And if there's any kind of declaration of interest or any possible coercion or bias. There's ethics committees, and I'm not going to go into that because we don't really have enough time. And there's an ethical approval process, which when we go on to the second research module, for those of you who will be joining me on that in April, we will talk about this at length about the ethical approval, because that's going to be something that's going to be very key in your mind. Going through IRAS, which is the Integrated Research Application System, which is complex, and we'll cover that in detail. So to conclude very quickly, ethics, it's unavoidable in healthcare practice and research. There is no study that you will have read that will have not gone through some ethical process or ethical consideration. In this country, it's mandatory. Being a good researcher requires you to be ethical and requires you to have ethics, principles and virtues, as well as knowledge and skills. So it's not just about taking the information or collecting the information, it's about what you do with it and how you react to it and how you act with it. And that's very important when you're undertaking research. An understanding of ethics and professional codes is essential for anybody who's professionally accountable. And everyday research ethics can be very challenging. And it's very good to look at different perspectives. And getting ethical clearance for a research study is fraught with complexity, but it can be a very interesting process to undertake. And then I've got some general references there if you want to have a look more at ethics. The first book there by Banks and Gallagher is a very useful book if you're interested in just general professional ethics. If you want to look at Beauchamp and Triangelis, the principles of biomedical ethics, they're very much focused on ethical considerations. And then there are a number of journals and websites that I can point you to as they're outlined there that can help you with ethics generally or nursing ethics more specifically. So that's very, very quickly through the presentation we missed from a fortnight ago. Have you got any questions on ethics? And more specifically, have you got any questions about the ethics of the studies that you're looking at? If you don't want to type, I'm very happy to open your microphones. If you want to ask a question, if you just indicate by putting your hand up. Hopefully you're all still alive out there in cyberspace. Good, I'm glad you're still there. There will be an aspect of it in the critique part, definitely. In the appendix, when you're talking about each different article that you've reviewed, and those form part of your appendix. That those form your appendix, or they form Appendix 1. There may be a discussion of them in the themes. It may be relevant to discuss them in the themes. It may be something about research ethics that has determined what one of the themes are. That's not necessarily the case, but it may be in certain fields that you're reviewing, as you're all coming at this from very, very different perspectives, I can't say that you'll all have a critique of ethics in your themes, but you may well have. If you're looking at, for example, one treatment versus another, and the studies that you have undertaken are looking at the studies that you've been reviewing are randomized controlled trial or intervention evaluations about one treatment versus the other, then there will be some sort of discussion about ethics, because if you're making a direct comparison between how people have reacted to one treatment versus how people have reacted or acted with another treatment, how can you compare like those two instances? Are you comparing like for like? When you were considering your samples, have you ensured ethically that your samples are completely equal? So when you're comparing your results, are you really truly doing a randomized control trial? Was there a degree of double-blind randomization? And if the randomization was undertaken by the researcher, was it ethical? So you've got lots and lots of questions that you could be asking yourself which have an ethical focus. Does that answer your questions? I'm not saying that you have to have ethics in the appendix of your literature summary. All of your studies will have undertaken ethics, and it might be something that you say in your critique. For example, if you've had to discuss why sampling has taken place, or how sampling has been undertaken, or if you've used, for example, purposive sampling, has that skewed your results? Has that caused bias? And is that ethical? Have the results therefore been presented are the results therefore robust and valid if the sampling undertaken wasn't done in an ethically sound manner? So it's not that there won't always be some ethical considerations, because there will. Whether that's had an influence on your research findings and authenticity of the research that you're reading I don't know, because I don't know what research you're looking at. But it may well be a question that you ask when you look at, if you've been asking questions of, for example, I'm just trying to think of a working example. If the research that you're focusing on is about, and Natalie, I'm not picking it, it's only because we had a conversation this morning, so I apologise if this is putting you on the spot, but an example that one of your colleagues came up with this morning was looking at clean versus aseptic technique. Now, when undertaking the sampling of that. So if, for example, you'd done a study in hospital and you'd looked at all of these patients, and you'd had a group that was having a clean technique and the others was having an aseptic technique, and you'd found in your results that there was no difference between the two, and therefore for a cost benefit you said, right, we're not going to do any more aseptic technique, we're going to do just clean because it's been proved to be the same. You would say that study possibly, had ethical soundness. But if you had undertaken that study and you had found that there was a dramatic increase in the amount of infections with the clean technique than there was with the aseptic technique, would it have been ethical to continue? So have the results been determined by the ethics of the question? Does that answer your questions? Yes, you are right, Jenny. They are a short description of the studies. They're just an outline. You've got columns where you're doing the main findings and the main critique, The example of a narrative review that was looking at attitudes to HIV patients gives more columns than I've put in my essential supporting information. But I've said at the beginning, I don't mind if you add more columns. The columns that I've put are the minimum that should be in your literature summaries. So yes, your literature summary should be a short description of the different studies that you've discussed in your narrative review. Whether there is a discussion of ethics is going to rather depend on the studies that you've looked at. It might be obvious that all studies that you've undertaken had ethical soundness and there were no ethical issues. And you might just make that simple one-line statement in your overall discussion in the second to last section. So that overall statements and recommendation section, you might say that ethics wasn't an issue, or ethical soundness was transparent across all studies. But it may not be the case. And if it's not the case, then discuss it further. Does that answer your questions? When I'm looking at your literature summaries, I might look at them and think, there are no ethical issues here. So I might make some comment that there was no discussion of ethics. Any other questions? Okay, so we're going to sort of stop talking about ethics now and go on to talk about qualitative research analysis. So this is following on very much from the qualitative research session that we did weeks ago now. It's a long time ago. And then you had, so just to remember, you had, I did a session on qualitative research methods, and Jenny did a session on quantitative research methods, which was your narrated PowerPoint. And hopefully you've all had a chance to access that and work through it. And please don't hesitate to contact Jenny. She's very happy to answer any questions that you might have about that content. So this session, this today was sort of divided up into two halves. And again, Jenny's done the section on quantitative analysis, and she's put a presentation that gives you an overview and insight into statistical analysis, because quantitative research, more often than not, has an element of statistical analysis. And she's put a narrated PowerPoint up, which I've added to the tile for today. So you've got that presentation to access. And again, if you have any questions on that, please don't hesitate to contact Jenny. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is qualitative research analysis. So you've got the other side of the question. And let's just recap. When we're talking about qualitative research, we're looking at questions that are asked about what's going on in a particular setting, or what are the relevant variables to a study, and which people take part, and what the meaning of that activity, and what concepts and categories are used, and what just the people think and feel. So when we're looking at qualitative research, we're looking at very different questions. No, if you have no qualitative research, then you possibly don't. But I am going to spend some time talking about thematic analysis, and a thematic analysis is what I want you to do to the research that you're looking at. So it might be worthwhile listening, but you can always access it as a recording. So when we're looking at qualitative research, we're trying to answer very, very epistemological questions. Remember, we use those words. So the strength of a piece of qualitative research is that it's far more holistic, it's far more flexible, and it's in-depth, rich, in-depth research. And it's trying to develop a real insight and a meaning inside how people feel or think or react to a certain scenario. So some of the different methods that we might use is we might use the individual interview. So if we've collected our data using an interview, then the practical thing that we need to then do is to transcribe that interview. Equally, if we've used a focus group interview. So once we've got that transcript, we have got a written representation of what has been collected. And in a way, your research articles are examples of written descriptions. So you've got exactly the same as I would with an individual interview, where I've got a transcript, I've got that written representation, you have got a written representation in your research articles. Equally, if you were undertaking participant research or observation or any kind of field notes, reflective diaries, case studies and so on, you've got a written representation of the data that you've collected, or a visual representation. So if you've done some observational, whether it be participant or non-participant, you've got a visual account of what's happened. That might be in the form of a video, it might be in the form of a checklist, it might be in all sorts of different formats, but what you're often left with is a written representation of the data. So whereas with quantitative research, which is why we talk about numbers, you might have a numerical representation to the information, we've got a written representation to the information. So basically what you're left with is a large amount of text. So you'll have the transcript of a conversation, or you might have documents, or you might have reports, or you might have a visual, so you might have a drawing or a video, or you might have a series of photographs. So there will be either a written or a visual representation to your data. And some of the key issues that we've got to think about are about purpose and motivation and sampling, but we'll have already done all of that. All of those discussions will have already taken place. So where we are as the researcher, although when we're analysing it, we've got to give we've got to be very aware of where we are as the researcher. So remember when we were talking about qualitative research back in October, I think it was, we talked about where we were epistemologically. So what our view of knowledge was and how we were going to react to the information that we were collecting. And that's where we've got to think about the reflexivity and the subjective-objective relationship that we have with the information that we're collecting. And we also, in qualitative research, we always talk about data is everything, that everything is data, and we collect everything. So we might have hugely long transcripts of long conversations, and we will have to unpick those conversations. We will also might have some reflective notes about how we were as the researcher in terms of our position. So I've already talked about ethics, haven't I, and our participation. But when you're analysing and you're looking at the analysis of qualitative data, where was the researcher? Was the researcher involved? Was the researcher detached and objective, or were they in the particular environment that they were collecting? If you're collecting an interview, or you're reviewing an interview from a research paper, how was the researcher positioned? Were they a senior member of staff? Were they a member of staff to a patient? What was the relationship that they had? And was there an indication of that relationship when they presented their data? Now, data analysis in this term is very, very time consuming. Although we do have software nowadays that will help us and help us unpick this kind of material, this kind of data, it is very time consuming. And when we look at the analysis, we're often talking about immersing ourselves in it so that we really get to grips with it and we really know the information that we've collected. And this is where in a qualitative study, we might suggest that we might look at the sample and think, oh, that's awfully small. So you might pick up a piece of research, or you might have read a piece of research where the sample has been 4 or 6 or 8 people, and you think to yourself, well, that's can't have value, because to get any kind of research, you need hundreds of people. You need to have asked hundreds of people, but it's not the number that counts, it's the amount of information that you've collected. So it might be adequate to just interview 6 people. That might be completely acceptable, because you're looking for something called data saturation, or theoretical saturation as we call it. Whereas where you're collecting information, you're interviewing people, you don't come across new information. You're just getting the same information over and over again. And so you don't need to collect any further information. And that might have determined the sample size. So when you're preparing a research proposal, you might not have a distinct and discrete number in mind. Whereas with a quantitative study, as I'm sure Jenny's talked about, it will be a statistician that's determined the sample size. So when you're looking at your research, that journey to sample size, has it been discussed? Has it been explained? So when we're looking at designing a study or looking at the studies that we're reading, why is this particular question of interest? And actually, when you start your narrative review, that's how you're going to do your introduction. Why is this particular issue of interest to you? Why is it particularly pertinent? Have you got a theoretical or practice-related or personal motivation or political question to answer here? Why is this particular subject area that you're writing about for your narrative review significant to you and your practice? But that's also one of the questions that you'll ask yourself if you're undertaking a piece of research. So we've looked at access when we talked about data analysis, and we've talked about different types of sampling, so I'm not going to cover that now. So what I want to look at is the types of analysis that we might undertake. And the types of analysis are predominantly either content analysis, thematic analysis, or hermeneutic analysis. I've put a paper up on the DLE about content analysis, so that you can read about that further. We're also going to talk about thematic analysis and hermeneutic analysis. So what do I mean by content analysis? This is a very descriptive analysis, so it doesn't necessarily reveal why something's happened. It examines communication text and social interaction. So what we tend to do with content analysis is that we review it for specific content. So if you're reviewing an interview, or your articles are looking at doing a piece of content analysis, they're looking for specific texts, specific quotes. They might have a particular phrase that has meaning for their research question that they're looking for, and they're seeing how it's used and where it's used and how often it's used. So there might be a numerical representation. So they might actually have a number, God forbid, in qualitative research, but there may be a number. And this is where people sometimes, or students sometimes, get a little bit confused, because they say, oh, I was reading this research article and I was absolutely sure it was qualitative. And then they came up with some percentages, or they came up with some numbers, or they might even have come up, unlikely, but they might have come up with a probability. And you might think, well, that doesn't have any relevance to the question that they've asked. But actually, if they've used an aspect of content analysis, they might have a numerical representation for a specific piece of information. So they examine the conversation and they examine the text for specific content. And that's what's different between content analysis and thematic analysis. So that in content analysis, you are looking for specific content. Whereas with thematic analysis, you are identifying patterns, themes. So meaning across different data sets I've put there, and it emphasizes pinpoints, examining and recording patterns. So if you're looking at a particular set of interview transcripts, you might be looking for particular themes or narratives that reoccur, that might explain behavior or explain the way somebody feels or explain something. And this is what I want you to do in your research. As you're reading the results and as you're reading the methodological, the methods of data collection, the analysis, what are you seeing reoccurring in patterns across the research that you've looked at? So you've done that lateral analysis. So you've done the literature summaries. So one by one, you've gone through the articles that you've chosen to review, and you've done whatever critical appraisal tool you've decided to use, you've followed. So I've said many times, I don't mind which one you use, whether you use Chemet, which is the one that Heather went through at the beginning of the module, or whether you use Moule and Heck's critical appraisal framework, or whether you use Garish and Lacey's, or I don't mind which one you use, but you've got to tell me which one you've used. So if, for example, you've used Moule and Heck, and you've looked therefore at the key questions that Moule and Heck ask you to ask of the research, so the purpose of the study, the research problem or question, the literature review, the ethical issues, the sampling selection, the research design and data collection, the results and analysis and the conclusions, and the general points. So they've broken it down into those headings. So you've done that lateral analysis. So one by one, you've gone through each of those research. The method by which you then go to look for themes is going to be different for all of you. But one of the techniques that I've used in the past is literally getting some colour-coded pens and looking for particular similarities across them. So if we pick, for example, the selection, in the sampling selection section, you've noticed that there are themes across the research, that they've all used a very similar strategy, and there's a rationale for that strategy, and that strategy has elicited similar or diverse results. So you might make some commentary about that particular theme. But more importantly, I'd like you to look at the findings. So across the findings, what themes emerged? So as you're reviewing each article and they've found specific things in their research, and then you look at the next piece of research and they've looked at specific things, and they've articulated that there were certain results that came out of their research study. Are those the same as the next one and the next one and the next one? So if you were going to highlight in purple specific phrases and specific results, do you see them across the research that you're doing? And that would be a thematic analysis. So if you were undertaking thematic analysis on an interview, and you had interviewed 6 particular staff nurses about their knowledge of clean technique versus aseptic technique, and you were asking them all about that, you will see that certain themes. So if you were asking what they knew about those particular techniques, you might find that they were saying, oh, you know, in their interview, they might all say something along the lines of, I know they're the same, but custom and practice means I use aseptic technique because that's what I've been taught to do. And that might be a theme. It might be about education. Or it might be, I don't have the time to use aseptic technique, so I don't. That might be another theme about time and workforce. So as you're looking through your research articles, you're looking for specific patterns and what meaning is attached to those patterns. And then you will give me a methodological critique of those particular themes. Any questions on that? No questions? Either raise your hand or type something if you like. Now, the aim in a piece of research is to find meaning across the different data sets that you've collected. So establish what you understand by a particular phenomena. Thematic analysis is most commonly or most usually used when we're using phenomenological research, which seeks to examine a narrative and get some meaning across that narrative. No questions? Stunned you into silence. I'm not sure whether that's worrying or good. Why are you panicking? Can I open your mic? I'm trying to think of a particular piece of quantitative research that I've looked at recently. I'm going to give that some thought. Just a minute, Hannah. Okay, so working example. Okay, if you're looking at if you're looking at some quantitative studies and they're all looking don't worry, Matt, it's all been recorded, so you can catch up from what we've said so far. We've talked a little bit about the essay today, so it might be worth reviewing the beginning of the session. Sorry, so to go back to Hannah's question about themes in quantitative research, as you're looking at the data sets that you've collected, so each of the particular research articles will have made some conclusions. So if you look at those conclusions, can you see similarities between the conclusions that they've come up with? So if they've evaluated a particular treatment and they've said in right, I'm much better at using examples with qualitative. You see, I'm a qualitative researcher. Okay, they've done statistical analysis. So they've done a lot of analysis about how effective sedation holds are in ITU. So what has the research said? It said that sedation holds are good, bad, indifferent. Some research might have looked at them in terms of undertaking procedures, and that's why they implement sedation holds, or that people's education of sedation holds changes the way they practice them, and those might be the themes that are coming out of the research that you've reviewed. Does that answer your question? So if you looked at every single, just as an exercise, if you looked at the 10, 15, 20, however many articles that you've got, it doesn't really matter whether they've come from a qualitative or quantitative perspective. Can you look at them and, with a colour-coded pen for simplicity's sake, highlight different concluding statements that they've made, or different results of the analysis that they've made? And in quantitative studies, they very typically, when they present them for journal articles, they do presentation of results where they give you lots of graphs and charts and statistical analysis, but they also then do a discussion. When you look at the discussion, can you literally highlight how similar certain things are, or how different? So can you see patterns occurring in the discussion and the conclusion of the research studies that you're reviewing? So and if you can, what is that saying about the methodological impact of that particular study? Okay. Absolutely. Yes, one article might appear across all, you might have got 4 themes, for example, and one article might appear across all 4, and one article might appear in just 2, one article might appear in 3, the next article might appear in a different 3, and so on. So you could form like a matrix, a pattern of how these themes have been developed. So if you've got 10, 15 articles, they might appear across all themes. One article might just fit in one theme. It's unusual, because otherwise why was it included? It's more likely to have 2 of the 4 themes. But yes, absolutely, one article might occur across, and that's the whole point. To have undertaken a thematic analysis of the research themselves, so they will appear across the themes. So does that answer your question? No, it's not. It's a very important question, Jenny. So I don't want you to panic, and also equally, I don't want you to think that this is a complicated undertaking. It might sound slightly complicated, but it really isn't. Look at the findings. Look at what each of your pieces of research are saying, and see where the patterns occur. See what common things keep reoccurring. See if you can you can group certain studies together. Physically highlight them in pen, or put them in different piles, or cut and paste them into a particular document, and see how similar they are as their concluding statements, or their presentation of findings, or whatever. And those are your themes. Now, because you've only got 3,000 words, I'm not expecting you to come up with 8, 10, 15 themes, because you just don't have the word count. But in a larger research study, you might come up with more themes. I would suggest that you all need to concentrate on 3 or 4 themes. What you might say at the beginning of your narrative review, so at the beginning of that 3rd section of your assignment, is there were a number of themes that came out of the research, and you might list them. Or you might put a table in the assignment. That way you don't have to include it in your word count. But then you say this assignment is going to focus on these 3 because you found them to be most prevalent, or you found those to be most interesting, or they have more of an indication to my professional practice than the other themes. Not that the other themes aren't important, but you aren't focusing on them because you've only got 3,000 words to play with. So you're not suggesting that this is the full stop when it comes to the themes that are coming out of your research. This is just saying, I'm going to focus on these because I've got a 3,000 word count. And if you do 5, 6 themes, it's going to be a little bit superficial. So concentrate on 3 to 4 and focus on those well. And then you might want to recap in your discussion about how there were other themes, but the focus has been on these 3, 4, and this is where you've taken and this is how you've developed your research question. So does that help in terms of your assignment as well as your knowledge of thematic analysis? Any other questions? Great, got 1 yes. That's not great stats, but never mind. I'll go with the 1 yes. Okay, so one of the other types of analysis that's used in qualitative research is hermeneutic analysis. Hermeneutic analysis is a way of interpreting and understanding what somebody says in terms of their language. And this is where we move sort of back and forth, and we talk about the hermeneutic cycle, about moving from theory to practice and practice back to theory. It's typically involved about seeking understanding and getting particular insight into the meaning of particular words and phrases. So typically we tend to use hermeneutic analysis when we've got some sort of recording or some sort of written data set. So for example, from a focus group interview, an interview or such like. And this is where we're looking for language. We're looking to really understand why people say what they say and what that phrase or particular language, what meaning it has. And we look at all the other types of communication that aren't verbal or written. So in hermeneutic analysis, your reflective diary or your reflexivity is going to be incredibly important, because some insight into the way people say things is just as significant as what they say themselves. So how they've used a phrase, where they've used a phrase, and what context that phrase has been delivered in, and how the patient was, or participant or subject was positioned when they used that particular language. A really simplistic example would be if you were sitting in a particular classroom, you might say, gosh, this is a lovely classroom, with a smile on your face and a relaxed manner. Equally, you might sit back in your chair and in a slightly dismissive manner fold your arms and go, gosh, this is a lovely classroom. Now, the way you've said it, your body language, the intonation in your voice gives completely different meaning to those phrases, those two exactly the same phrases. And so when we're looking at language and we're looking at the way people say things and how they say them and how they deliver a particular line or a particular response to a question, gives us a degree of insight into how they're feeling or how they're interpreting the data that you're giving, how they're interpreting the situation that they're in, and in turn how you need to interpret that data. So there's some lovely pieces of hermeneutic phenomenology where they've looked at the narrative and they've really pulled apart the language that was used. Typically a particular research piece that I'm thinking of is about, was done on student nurses when they went into their first practice placement in their nurse training, and the language that they used and some of the phrases that they came across about being dumped in practice for the first time and being terrified by the nurses. and not seeing themselves as nurses, seeing themselves as imposters and guests in somebody's house, and phrases and language that they use really got an insight into the way students feel when they visit a particular practice placement. And so when you're unpicking what those students felt and how they were positioned in terms of their first practice placement, you got a real insight into what was going on in their head to really understand how it felt to go out into practice for the first time. So hermeneutic analysis can be incredibly revealing into getting real meaning into how somebody feels or thinks about a particular undertaking. So the process with hermeneutic, thematic and content analysis is pretty much the same. We're going to transcribe a particular data set, whether that's from a recording or a visual, a video, or whatever. So we've talked about some of the methods of data collection, and we're going to revisit it, read it several times to really understand what's going on in a particular article. Sorry, I'll just recap on this question. Yes, absolutely. If they've mentioned that they've used hermeneutics, have they used it appropriately? Is it clear as to how they've used this methodological tool in their data analysis, and does it form, if when exploring your themes, was it a valuable part of that particular theme? So yes, if they've used hermeneutics, then I would suggest that you do make comment on it and demonstrate your understanding of its significance when examining data. So it went great. Glad that answered the question. So reading the things several times, and this is actually what you're going to be doing, isn't it, with your articles? You can't just read them once. You need to read them and then reread them, and then you read them again with that sort of knowledgeable eye. You might put them aside. You might have done your preliminary analysis of them by using your data, your critical appraisal tool, and then you may reread them once you've read a few more articles. And it's that revisiting and repeating the process that really gets you to know what you're reading about. Because then it isn't until you've read something more than once so you're going to really be able to get to grips with what the article has said and what it really means. And then start coding the content. And how you choose to code it is completely up to you. Now, there are great pieces of software when you come to do your own research, you might access that look for particular words and phrases in a text. Equally, you can do a sort of a piece of find and replace on a Word document. So if you've saved your articles as PDFs, if you've got an annotated PDF program on your computer, you will be able to do this. You'll be able to type in certain words, certain content, certain phrases, and see where they reoccur across a particular article. If we were doing a piece of hermeneutic analysis on a interview transcript, we might type in a particular word or phrase and see where it reoccurs. We might also need to look at some dictionary definitions and see if there were other words that could be used in its place. So if you were looking for an insight into why students feel nervous in practice placements, you might not use just the word nervous. You might use uncertain, unsure, frightened, and so on. So you might want to have some set phrases. So when you're looking at the themes in your articles, they might not come up with exactly the same phrase or language, but the essence, the meaning is the same. And that's what you're looking for. So you're going to be cross-checking and coding your particular research articles. Equally, if you were undertaking this analysis, you'd be cross-checking against the data of the same participant, so throughout the same article, and you will also be looking at it across multiple articles, where if you were doing it as a piece of research, you'd be looking at within the same interview transcript and then across many interview transcripts, hoping that you'd be able to group and code the information accordingly. When I've undertaken interviews in the past, I'm old-fashioned and a bit of a visual person, so I'm a demon with the colour highlighters. I do like a coloured highlighter to show me how certain phrases and certain themes emerge. So that might be the method that you use. Equally, you might have a different method to highlight the themes or code your information. So once we've categorized all of those particular similarities, we can then group them into themes. And then as we build those themes, we're looking for examples that either explore and advance that theme further, and equally some negative examples. So is there something that falls outside that theme or confirms or refutes something that we're feeling? So when we're undertaking research itself, if we have an interview that falls outside what we've found so far, this is what I was talking about when I talked about theoretical saturation, we might want to explore some of the themes that have emerged from a new set of information. Equally, we might discount that and exclude that from our research because it falls outside and it doesn't fulfill the criteria that we're pursuing. We have to be a little bit careful there, because one would argue that are we just ignoring the things that don't fit what we want them to fit? So we have to be very careful in our biases when we're doing our inclusion and exclusion criteria. Equally, if you find a piece of research that falls outside your themes and it doesn't support what you're thinking, should you exclude it? Should you exclude it methodologically? So did it not fulfill the criteria that you have set for inclusion in your narrative review, in which case you can justifiably exclude it. If it does fulfill the criteria that you've set aside for inclusion, but comes up with a completely different set of ideals or completely different set of results, then you have to acknowledge it. It would be unethical to exclude it. And why is it so far outside what you've found to be true? Why is it so different from the pattern that you've established for yourself? And maybe there's a key difference or fundamental difference in its sampling technique or its data collection method or its ontology and epistemology. So maybe there is something that is innately different in this particular piece of research, which has resulted in it being different from what you found up till now. So those exceptions to the rules are always very interesting to explore. We're always looking for rigour, which rigour in any kind of research equates to some degree of quality. Excuse me. So I'm looking for some rigour in this research review. Are your findings real? Are they trustworthy? So have we triangulated? And the triangulation I'm looking for in your narrative review is that data search. That search strategy is going to demonstrate to me that you've looked at different data sources, different databases, you've gone to different sets of criteria to establish that you've got more than one view on the world. And there's a clarity to the process. So if I undertook exactly the same data selection process as you have, I would get the same, if not similar, results. So is there an audit trail? And when you're looking at your studies, you're also looking for this. Did the process match what they found? Can you demonstrate that what they found at the end of their research is clearly indicative of the method that they undertook and the analysis that they undertook? And that there is a level of reassurance. So we talk about respondent validation or second coda. If somebody else picked up your literature review, would they get the same themes or similar themes? Equally, if I was doing a piece of research, if I gave it to somebody else and said, these are the phrases that I'm looking for, would they get the same results as me? So you're looking at that level of authenticity of the information that you've collected when you're undertaking qualitative analysis. Equally, I'm looking for a level of authenticity in your narrative review, that if I did the search, or whoever's marking it does the search, they're going to come up with similar results. And when they've analysed it using the critical appraisal tool that you have selected, would they come up with similar results? You might want to give a nod, especially in your... Sorry, I'll just look at this question. Yes, in your data, in your search strategy, which is section 2 of your assignment, and we'll recap the assignment guidelines next week. But in that second section, you're very much looking at what data searches did you do, where did you look, so what databases did you go to, how many articles did you come up with, and how did you refine those articles, and what led you to choose the articles that you've chosen. And then you're going to highlight which critical appraisal tool you've chosen to use, and then go into your narrative review. So yes, absolutely, I need that audit trail of how you got your articles, and equally a researcher would be presenting their audit trail as well. So when we're looking at reflexivity of the researcher is aware of how they've been influenced by the process. Has the researcher shown insight into this and her biases or his biases in a way which could influence the outcome? So when we're undertaking research, we're going to ensure that we're not preempting the results. We're not looking for specific results. We're not guiding the respondents into giving us the results that we want. So when we've asked a question, if we've interviewed a participant, we haven't guided them into saying what we wanted them to say. And equally, when you set the scene in your introduction, I'd like you to demonstrate that you have some insight into your own area of interest. I'm not looking for bias, because I'm actually suggesting that you tell me exactly why you've wanted to choose this particular subject. But your background and who you are as a practitioner is going to have an influence on how you've responded to the results and how you've responded to the research that you've reviewed. So if you're a surgical care practitioner, or you're a advanced critical care practitioner, or an advanced nurse practitioner, whatever your background is, that is going to have some indication and some influence on not only the subject that you've chosen, obviously, but the way you've interpreted the results. And so you've got to let me know who you are and why you've particularly come to these conclusions. Not in the first person, though. I don't want any eyes in this article. I mean, in this narrative review. It's one of my pet hates, but you'll... So there's a number of references, and those of you who are particularly interested in qualitative research and are going to undertake any critical research, then There are lots of key people there, but in terms of your particular research review, this article by Mays and Pope about qualitative research, assessing quality and qualitative research from the BMJ is a particularly good article. It's also, it's short and it's easy to read, and it gives you a real insight into what quality is in qualitative research. So I would definitely recommend a little read of that one, especially if you've got a number of pieces of qualitative research to review. The phrase "the author" suggests that you might be J.K. Rowling, and I'm not sure that any of you are. So there's a way of phrasing this. So this narrative review has focused on, if you're writing in the third person, I would suggest you go down that view. And actually, if you look at the Learning Support website, which is, and I'll just get that up for a moment, if my screen's gone blank. You can use the abbreviation as CAS for critical appraisal. Whose is that, Naomi? I don't know who published it. So I don't need you to tell me right now, but it would need to have a reference. So I'm happy for you to use it if it fits the one you've, if it fits what you're writing, but I need it to be referenced. So who published it and whose was it, and then yes, absolutely fine. I know writing in the third person, writing in the first person are always slightly challenging. You spend a lot of time, or we spend a lot of time in nursing writing in the first person, writing reflection, writing reflectively. But this is an academic assignment, and I want you as level 7 master's students to really get to grips with the difference and really get to grips with how you write differently. And it's a skill that you need to be aware of. And it also, the ability to go from one to the other is really significant, it's really important, and it allows for that sort of academic development. So I know it's challenging, I have to do it myself, but I think it's really important that in this particular assignment, and if you come on to do the second research module, it's going to be just as important. But when you come to do your dissertation, it may be appropriate for you to write in the first person, and that's absolutely fine. So that will be a discussion for you and your supervisors. But in additional resources, which there's something, the first one there, the link there to learning development, they give you lots of tips, and there's some Word documents and some exercises about writing in the third person. And so if you are struggling with that sort of phrase and that sort of approach, then please go to the Learning Development website. Equally, the Writing Development site here, this particular tab, which takes you to RASSE, WRASSE, which is a writing development site. You can put level 7 and look at specific examples of writing at level 7 and how they've written when they've written in the third person. I personally don't like the phrase "the author," but if that's the one that you use, then I wouldn't be particularly negative about it, but I equally wouldn't be that positive about it either, without sounding too mean. Okay, any other questions? What, you've never written the author? Okay. Well, my advice would be don't start now then. So, okay. So going back to our presentation, have you got any questions about qualitative analysis? Oh no, I don't want that at all. Sorry, I've clicked the wrong thing. I'm going to have my emails opening now. Just let me get rid of that. Right, so going back to the qualitative analysis, any questions, any comments? I realise that some of you won't have any qualitative studies to review. You might be focusing purely on quantitative studies, and that's absolutely fine. But the technique of doing a thematic analysis is the same for a narrative review as it is for research data if you're undertaking a qualitative study. So the principles are very much the same. Any questions? I feel like I've gone very quickly today. It doesn't matter if all your research is one type, i.e. qualitative or quantitative, because it's going to be very much dependent on your subject area. So if you are looking at, and if my memory serves me correctly, Dawn, you're going to be looking at treatment escalation plans and nurses' knowledge and attitudes towards them. Is that correct? Are you still going down that line? Right, so more doctors' attitudes towards treatment escalation plans, but it's about their knowledge and skills or their attitudes towards. So the chances are that the research is going to be qualitative because there isn't going to be quantitative research written about that particular subject area. So that's the trick in your introduction of your assignment, is to actually outline to me why you've chosen the subject that you've chosen and ensure that it's clear as to the ontology and epistemology of yourself. That's why I say it's important that you tell me who you are, and therefore the methodological approaches that the research has taken. It would be an ideal world, wouldn't it, that if you pick a subject area and there were 20 pieces of research and 10 were qualitative and 10 were quantitative, but that's not what, I'm very pragmatic, that's not what real life is, and that's not what happens in real life. And so equally, whereas your focus, Dawn, is going to be very much on the qualitative studies, somebody else might have purely quantitative studies. They might be looking at a treatment intervention process in intensive care, which is purely quantitative in its essence, and that's absolutely fine. So the trick here is to, one, pick the appropriate critical appraisal tool. And so I will be giving a degree of marks and, to your choice. So why have you chosen that critical appraisal tool? And why have you done that sort of database search? Because obviously, just in the same way as a piece of research needs to match, so does this narrative review need to match. So where is your ontology and epistemology? And why is it that you've gone down this particular route? Why are you asking this particular question? So it's that level of transparency and robustness to the whole process that is really important. So no, it's not problematic that it's all qualitative. Equally, it's not problematic if it's all quantitative, and it's not problematic if it's mixed. You just need to demonstrate that you understand what's happening and why things are happening that way. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay. Any other questions? Lauren, I'll get to your question in a minute. Any other questions about the analysis session? That article on content analysis is really interesting if you've got some time to look at it, and if you've got any qualitative studies, then I would suggest that you have a look at that article by Mays and Pope. And actually in that reference list there are 3 articles there, but it's the article from 2000 about assessing quality and qualitative research that I would focus your attention on. Equally, if you go to a database or if you go to the Nurse Researcher, which is a particular journal, and you search establishing rigour in qualitative research and establishing rigour in quantitative research, you'll throw up with some really nice articles about what is considered to be quality in both qualitative and quantitative studies. So that is a mechanism by which you can have some more references to support your discussion. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so we have our final session next week, and it's not going to be a particularly long session. The webinar will start at 1, and we'll be doing it very much as a Q&A. I will go over the research, I will go over the assignment guidelines again. I will go and answer any questions. If you have any questions in advance, then please send them to me and I'll address them during the webinar. If you feel that you're so far ahead you don't need another session on the actual assignment itself, then please don't feel that you need to attend. It's completely voluntary, this last session. But if you do want to access it, then great. I look forward to seeing you next Tuesday afternoon at 1. So many of you have got tutorials lined up. I've seen all of the surgical care practitioners now, and I've seen the advanced critical care practitioners, and I'm coming back to see you again next week because you're back in university next week, aren't you? Back in hospital, I should say, next week. So I'll be seeing you for my usual Thursday afternoon tutorial. So please don't, please, if there are any questions after next week, then don't hesitate to contact me. If you've got a tutorial booked with me, unless we've specified otherwise, it will be in my office, and my office address and location is on the bottom of all of my emails. I'm in Portland Villas, number 7 Portland Villas, room 104. But as I said, the address is on my signature banner of my email. I know I've got a few of you to see tomorrow, including one telephone tutorial. I've got that in my diary, Michelle, for 1:30. Do you want me to change that to 12? Okay. I've got a tutorial with another one of your colleagues at 11, so I can phone at 12 if that's easier, or I can do it at 1:30. It's not a problem at all. If you could email me with your phone number, because I don't seem to have it written in my book, that would be great. So If you've got a tutorial booked, great. If you haven't got a tutorial book and you still would like one, please do get in contact soon. They're both absolutely fine. Honestly, it makes no difference to me whatsoever. I'll either phone you before I go and have some lunch, or I'll phone you when I get back from lunch. I don't mind. So maybe if you email me your phone number, Michelle, I'll try you at 12. If I get you then, great. If I don't, I'll try you back at 1:30. Okay, brilliant. So if you've got a tutorial booked, that's absolutely fantastic. If you haven't got a tutorial booked, please get in touch with me. I am around next week, the week of the 12th, and I am back from Christmas on the 5th, and then we haven't got long before the assignment is due in. I'll see and speak and read and whatever to any of you up until the 23rd. After the 23rd, I'm afraid I won't review any material, but if you have specific questions, I will address those in email prior to submission on the 30th. Okay, so please get in touch if you want either a phone tutorial or a face-to-face, but I am running out of spots in my diary at the moment, but please do get in touch. Additional to that, and this is really, really important, I know you're not all still with me, and I know some of you aren't with me live and will be accessing this as a recording, but please could you complete the module evaluation. It's on the tile for the final day. It's an online evaluation, and so if you could access that at your leisure and please complete it, that would be great. Developing this module for the future, it's really important that I know what you think, what worked well, what particular sessions you enjoyed, what particular aspects of the sessions that you enjoyed, what you thought didn't go so well. Equally, unfortunately, I can't do anything about the fact that it's a distance learning delivery, but we are looking at different technology such as Skype for Business and other things. So if you feel it's the technology that's really hindering you, then please do let me know, and maybe we can look at different technology, but it is always going to be delivered as a distance learning option at the moment. So please complete the module evaluations if you have, because that really helps me in the development of the module. And as I said, I'll be with you again next week, and it will be an assignment focused tutorial, and if you have any specific questions, either bring them on the day or email them in advance. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention. If you've got any additional questions, then email me, or I will be in the office for at least the next 45 minutes if you want to give me a ring. Okay, so thank you very much, and I'll see you all next week. Well, that's a good thing, Polly.